So first we'll start off with what is an invasive species. There's lots of definitions for this, and in Wisconsin the legal definition for invasive species is that it covers only non-native species and the introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. This or is likely to cause is really important because that allows us to put species on our invasive species list that are not yet here in the state. That we know that when they get here they're going to be a problem, but we can put them on ahead of time. And it covers all these different organisms. We're going to talk only about plants today. And we're only going to be talking about the terrestrial plants today. Big impacts on our big economic areas in Wisconsin. Agriculture, forestry, and tourism are three of our, by far, are some of our biggest industries in the state. All three are really severely impacted. Here's just an example of the impact in a forest, nice open-grown oak that has gotten filled in now with buckthorn. Honeysuckle does the same thing. And if you were to get on your hands and knees underneath this buckthorn, you'd see nothing under there except buckthorn seedlings and maybe garlic mustard. And trees can't come up underneath it, and you're not going to be having a forest in there unless you deal with that buckthorn eventually. We're seeing woodlands in the Chicago area where they've had buckthorn for a lot longer time than we have, where the older trees are dying now, and so there's nothing there. There's just a buckthorn thicket, nothing else coming up. So some examples of some of these invasive species. You've probably all heard of the emerald ash borer. None up in this area yet that I know of. Down in the
river edge.
Yeah, the river edges. Yeah, not quite this area yet.
Right.
And Asian carp is coming up the Mississippi River. Zebra mussels are starting to be found in a number of inland waters, unfortunately. Kudzu is one of the ones that we put on our prohibited species list because it's not here yet as far as we know, but it may be, and we don't see, and we think at least in the southeast part of the state it could certainly survive. It's in northern Illinois, northeast Illinois. It's just north of Chicago. There's a very large patch of it that's producing seeds that are viable. So we do expect it to be here. There's lots of impacts of invasive species. Just to cover some of them, this is a bat caught in burdock. You may be aware of that we have white nose syndrome of bats, which is kind of knocking on the door of Wisconsin at this point. And it's not here yet, and we're doing lots of surveys and probably more work than just about any other state that doesn't have white nose syndrome yet. And so our bats are already very threatened. And in some places, they're getting caught in places like this with burdock. Anyway, spreads in natural areas, that's a main thing that we see problems with invasive species. They outcompete native species, particularly plants. They prevent the forest regeneration, as we mentioned. They can alter ecosystems, actually alter the soil and the nitrogen levels and other chemical levels in the soil. When there's a lot of nitrogen in the soil, it's really great for weedy species. Weeds that grow fast like high nitrogen. Things like prairies really don't need high nitrogen. And so when you get a lot of runoff from agricultural fields or other ways that nitrogen gets in the soil, then you're going to increase your weediness. Degrading wildlife habitat, lots of agricultural, economic, social damage that caused by these species. Specifically on utility and road corridors, there's a lot of problems with visibility, and they have to mow, they're required to mow for safety in certain areas, and the reason why they mow is for safety. Almost exclusively it's for safety. And so if you have a desire to get them to just stop mowing completely, it's not going to happen. They have to mow for safety purposes, and especially when you have something like Phragmites that gets 10 feet tall right next to the road, you've got to keep that down. So there's a lot of potential problems that come with this. It can also be a big safety problem. Up in Green Bay, apparently a couple of years ago, there was a one-car accident. Car went off the road and into the Phragmites. Nobody found them for several days, and by the time they found them, the person had died. So, because if you think how easy it would be for a car to disappear in 12-foot tall, thick grasses like that. One of the other big problems is, of course, that these things that highway corridors tend to spread invasive species. And so they move from the right-of-way corridors into adjacent properties. And so and everybody's next to a road. And so we all have lands that are affected by roadsides. So it's a big concern there because they're really vulnerable to invasive species. High light, high disturbance, lots of seeds and plant parts coming into the area, not only from their own maintenance equipment, but things like trucks moving things along. When trucks go flying by at 65 miles an hour, there's a lot of seeds to get moved around. Now, some of these things were intentionally planted on roadsides. Fortunately, none of these species are still being planted on roadsides, except for the bird's foot trefoil in some cases. But when they get planted, they tend to just cause these blankets that just cover over everything else. And crown vetch is an interesting one in particular. This time of year, it hasn't started greening up yet. It's really late to leaf out. And so if we had heavy spring rains, like we usually do, then you can get a lot of erosion under crown vetch because there's no vegetation early in the spring to hold that back, as opposed to if you had a nice grassland in there, it would hold the soil in better. Multiflora rose was planted for windbreaks along roadsides, as well as on farms. It has spread, gets into pastures, gets into woodlands. Really difficult to walk through a woods or a pasture that has multiflora rose. It hurts. So there's a number of characteristics that make invasive plants invasive. There are certain things about them, and it's important to think about that as you're working with invasives. There are things that tend to have really high growth rates, and they spread very effectively. Oftentimes they can spread both by seed and vegetatively. They can be really adaptable. They can move around a lot. One of the plants, Japanese hedge parsley, that's a biennial that's starting to spread more in the south. That thing, I've seen it flower in my mowed lawn. I accidentally brought it into my lawn, and it flowers nice and low, a couple inches, and I've seen it get as tall as giant ragweed in order to compete against giant ragweed for sun. And so they can be very adaptable. I was up at High Cliff today, garlic mustard all over the place in open areas. We think of garlic mustard as being a shade-loving plant. Well, it can also do really well in sun if it wants to. And most of these things have certain capabilities of outcompeting native species by doing things like putting chemicals into the soil, or altering, adding nitrogen to the soil, or killing the mycorrhizal fungi that tree roots need in order to absorb nutrients from the soil. So they have very specific chemical tools to make them compete better than others. And in addition to that, they also have these chemical tools that keep them from being impacted by our native insects and predators. Where they grew up over in, most of these came from Europe or Asia, then they had insects that evolved with them and kept them in check. So garlic mustard isn't a problem in Europe. It's out there, but it's not invasive there, because there's lots of critters in Europe that feed on garlic mustard. But here, there's nothing doing that, and so that's why it can just take off. So some of the properties of these species, they tend to be wind or bird dispersed. Sometimes they use us, and they have little hooks on them so they can travel along on mammals especially. Oftentimes they green up really early. You look out, 2 weeks ago, you looked out and in the woodlots, everything in the understory of the woodlots that was green was probably either buckthorn or garlic honeysuckle. Most of the natives normally don't start leafing out this early. Now the natives are starting leafing out this year. They can put in actually an allelopathic chemical that kills other plants. And they can alter a fire regime. Some of these species, Phragmites, if you've ever seen Phragmites burn, it's really scary. That plant can, 12 foot tall, very dense, dead stems. Those flames can easily reach 40 feet high and very, very hot flames. And normally you wouldn't have that hot of a fire going through a wetland, but or you may have a situation like with spotted knapweed in a prairie where you're trying to burn your prairie and you can't because the spotted knapweed doesn't burn because there's not much vegetation there. So it can be both ways. So it's important to kind of understand the plants that you're dealing with if you're going to be trying to control these plants in some way. You should know something about what kind of habitat do they like. So if you're doing control, do you need to worry about it if it's something that really likes shade? If it gets out in an open area, maybe you don't need to worry about it there. If it likes wet versus dry, what kind of a life form it is, how long it lives. Is it an annual, it just produces seeds and that's all? A biennial, that like garlic mustard, where it germinates 1 year, grows up and forms a rosette, and then overwinters has that rosette, and the next year flowers? Is it a perennial, comes back every year? Does it spread by its root system? What point in this plant is the most vulnerable? So just a real quick look at some of these things. So an annual just produces seed. Your only goal there is to keep it from going to seed. The same with biennials. There's a winter in here, but your goal there again is to keep it from going to seed. Whereas the perennials, you got to kill the root system for the most part if you want to get rid of it. I want to mention a couple of particular species, especially if you're going to be working on doing any control and survey work. One of them that we're hoping that you'll be helping with some survey work on is poison or wild parsnip. And this plant blooms usually late June, early July, and this year it'll be early. And it looks like kind of like a Queen Anne's lace. It's in the carrot family, but it's yellow. It's the only one of these that's weedy and is yellow. There's a couple of natives that are nice small plants in prairies that also have yellow umbel or umbrella-shaped flowers like this. But for the most part, this was one that you'll find on roadsides. It's got distinctive, large, pinnately compound leaves where there's little leaflets that come off of each, and those individual leaves can be very large. This plant, if you get the sap on your skin and your skin is exposed to sunlight, even on a cloudy day, you will get a burn from it. It's not a rash like poison ivy. It's not something that you're allergic to or you're not allergic to. Everybody can get this burn. And it can be pretty bad, especially if you're walking through it like with shorts on. Then it can be, people have to go to the hospital for this frequently. So I also wanted to tell you about the giant hogweed. This is a relative of the wild parsnip. It's also an umbel plant, and you can see these big umbel flowers, and those individual flowers can be big, really big across. The individual leaves can be up to 3 feet across, and this plant is one of our only federal noxious weeds in Wisconsin. And we know of it in 2 areas of Wisconsin, Iron County up on the border with the UP, and Manitowoc County, in several places in Manitowoc County. As far as we know, all the populations are being controlled. There's the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator in that county is doing a great job of working with the landowners and making sure that none of them actually produce seed. But this one is one that has a potential for getting in this area. So if you see something like this, let us know. There's 2 lookalikes to this. One is a relative that is called cow parsnip that's just much, much smaller than this. It can maybe get 6-7 feet. And the leaves are not that massive. And it also doesn't have this reddish at the nodes there. The other one is Angelica that's found in wetlands. And for those, instead of having this kind of umbrella-shaped flower, it has spheres, so like a globe of flowers. So don't call me if you see either of those, but call me if you see this one. Okay, I want to give you an idea of what these perennial species, especially the ones with a creeping root system, can do. They did a study where they built this big box of soil. They put in just a little fragment of a root from Canada thistle. And we all know Canada thistle is a real pain. But this is kind of an experiment to see how much this Canada thistle could grow in 1 year. Let it grow for a year, and it produced 300 feet of shoots, and double that of roots. So it's really quite impressive what one of these plants can produce. And so if this is in the ground, there's no way, like you try to plant native plants in there, there's no way they're going to be able to compete with this. You got to kill the root system, and you can only kill the root system with something like this by continually weakening it, or using some kind of an herbicide that's going to get into the root system and kill it. I also wanted to mention some of the vines, because these are some of the new things coming into the state now. Is we've got a number of vines that are kind of on their way and will be here and will be spreading a lot more. The one that's fairly abundant in some areas is the Oriental bittersweet. And it's got a very rounded leaf, and the fruits are at the nodes, so there's just a few fruits at each node, as opposed to the American bittersweet, which has a more pointy leaf and the fruits are all at the ends. And so this plant can climb up into a canopy of trees, pull down the trees during a windstorm, an ice storm, and do the same thing for power poles and things like that. So this can be a real problem plant. It completely blankets over forests. Okay, because things get abundant like that and blanket over forests is a reason why we want to catch things early. So this chart kind of explains why it's important to catch things when they just get introduced. If you can find something before it's really spread a lot, especially before it produces seed or before it's reproduced in some way, really simple to get rid of. One garlic mustard plant in your county park, first plant showing up there, you pull it out and you've dealt with it. And you just kept a population from developing there. You should go back every year and make sure there aren't more, but you've kept a population from spreading. So it's really important to catch things when they're just starting to come into an area, especially these new invaders like that giant hogweed. If you wait until people start noticing it and start complaining, it's getting really late. And by that time, you've got a lot more work to do to try to control it. And you probably all can think of populations of things that are already at this point where it would be a lot of work and a lot of money to try to control it. So here's an example of that happening. Hill mustard is a plant that no one had ever heard of in Wisconsin for the most part. We had a new agronomist that came into Wisconsin, and somebody sent him this plant from a pasture in Greene County, and he realized it was this hill mustard that has spread elsewhere in the country. And the farmer didn't do anything about it. And so that year it went to seed, and in a couple of years we saw not only in the local area but all back here, all those hills are yellow. Only 4 years from the first plant to the entire, basically like a couple of townships had hill mustard spread in it. Mostly they got spread long distance from roadside mowing. So with early detection species, obviously preventing seed production is number one thing. Eradicate if it's possible, but monitor and keep controlling on a yearly basis. If you are going to do some kind of invasive plant control work, if you're not going to be able to follow through and actually do it regularly, consider if it's really worth wasting your time to do, because you really want to be able to get in there and keep it out long term. So especially important to go after those new ones again and the prohibited species. Okay, real quick overview of some of the control methods that are best to use for some of these different species. So for biennials, again, biennials and annuals, you want to stop it from going to seed. Hand pulling, really good. Mowing at the right time of year, when they've started to flower but before they've started to set seed, is also really good. Or spraying them before they've set flower. If you go in and want to control garlic mustard, and I keep using that because everybody knows that one, if you go in and do your hand pulling before it starts to flower, you don't have to even pull it out of the woods. You know, those May dates you have on for your pulls, way late. It would be a whole lot easier if all those dates were in April, and they were done, you know, in April when the plants are much smaller. You wait for another month from now to pull those plants. They're going to be a lot bigger. You're going to have to put them in bags, and it's a lot more work. Mowing for biennials, and I'm going to lump wild parsnip into biennials right now. Really important to mow them at that early flowering stage. If you mow too early, they'll send up the flowering stalk and reflower. They may do it even if you do it at the right time. But if you do it too late, then generally these plants can go ahead and produce seeds, even though the seeds haven't fully matured when they're on the stem. You cut them, they can still continue to grow into seeds. Perennials, again, all of those things, but also you can spray again before flowering. And the creeping perennials, ones with a really big root system, you can mow to prevent seeds. So things like Phragmites, you can mow to prevent the seeds, and it'll actually knock down the population enough so you don't have to spray such a large area. So Japanese knotweed, for example, gets, 12, 14 feet high. And you don't want to have to go in there and spray something that's that high. It's a whole lot easier if you can go in there, mow at the end of the summer, and let it grow back up again, and then spray the smaller resprouts that are coming back up. A whole lot easier. For some of the grasses like Phragmites, what they do in places like the Lake Michigan beaches up in Door County is they take you take a piece of twine and you wrap your arms around a whole bundle of it and you tie it into a bundle, and you get that batch as tight as you can in a bundle. Then you come by with shears and cut off the tops, and then somebody can come by with a sprayer and do like a cut stump spray where you use a fairly high level of herbicide, a high concentration of herbicide, and you spray it onto the tops, and it gets down into the root system. And it's a pretty effective way of controlling it. It's the same technique that you would use with shrubs. So with shrubs, buckthorn, honeysuckle, you cut them and then you treat that cut stump, otherwise it'll resprout. You probably all had experiences of cutting a stem and then it resprouts. And doing it this time of year is the worst time of year you could do it. Right now, all that sap is going up. You don't want to be pushing that herbicide off the stump. You want it to come suck down into the stump. Do it in the fall. And this time of year, there's way too much else to do anyway. You got all your other gardening and outside chores to do. Vines, pretty much the same thing as the shrubs. You can pull them off of trees, but again, you're going to need to treat that stump in order to actually kill the root system. Okay, I'm real quickly going to mention the invasive species rule and the best management practices. The invasive species rule was developed in over 5 years. It went into effect in 2009. It's a pretty comprehensive rule, covers lots of species, and there's two parts to it. There's a list of species and then the regulations that apply to them, and there are preventative measures. And so the two groups of species are prohibited and restricted. Prohibited are those that are not here yet. So this is the kudzus and the white nose syndrome, the ones that we really want to be able to keep out. As soon as they show up, we want to be able to jump on it and stop that population from spreading. Restricted are the ones that are already here. Things like garlic mustard, spotted knapweed, parsnip. We're acknowledging they're way too widespread to really try to eradicate them in the state. And so the difference in the regulations is that for both of these groups, you can't transport them, which means move them around, either intentionally or unintentionally. You can't transfer them, buying them, selling them, giving them away. And you can't introduce them. For a plant means putting it out on the landscape somehow. The big difference is this possess. For plants in Wisconsin, if you have a plant on your property, you're in possession of it. Whether you introduced it there or not, every weed on your property, you're in possession of. And so if it's a prohibited species, we don't want people possessing those. We want to get rid of them. And so we're going to be working with people to try to control those. If it's a restricted species, control is encouraged. You're not required to control all those because we know that you probably can't, or at least a lot of you won't be able to control all of those restricted species. If you're doing control work or disposal, or if you're taking it to the extension office or sending it to me for identification, you can do the transporting. The other big thing that you need to know is that it's because we know these things are going to get accidentally transported. You know, when people are mowing or some other way, your dog goes running through an area and gets the seeds on them from Japanese hedge parsley, then they're going to be transporting it. So it's not going to be considered to be a violation if it was accidental or unknowing and you took reasonable precautions. And reasonable precautions means a number of things, but it specifically means the best management practices that were developed by different organizations to prevent the spread of these species. So both plants and disease organisms and pests. So we were developing these BMPs at the same time as we were developing the rules. And so for each of these sets of best management practices, we had a set of people working on them. For example, with the recreational users, we had people representing the horseback riders and the ATVers and the motorcyclists and the mountain bikers and the hikers and the dog walkers. And so they all came up with a set of best management practices. There are manuals online for each one of these, and they're fairly detailed. So I'm just going to give, but they all kind of cover these various categories of things that we want people to do. And so as an example of kind of the range of things that you can do is that we always want people, if you're taking equipment into an area, we want it to be clean before you go into an uninfested area, because we know that a lot of these seeds get moved around by equipment, like logging equipment or mowing equipment. And then clean it, if you're in an infested area, clean it before you leave. And so there's a variety of ways you can do that. If you have emerald ash borer in your woods and you're chipping it with a chipper, you may need one, and you're going to move that chipper somewhere else, you may want to steam clean it to make sure that those emerald ash borers, just in case there were any little eggs or something that were in there, because you really don't want to be spreading emerald ash borer. But if you're on a roadside and you know that there's going to be more of these weeds just a half mile down the road, then maybe just brushing it off with a broom might be effective. So mowing is the other big one that I wanted to mention. Again, kind of try to drill this into the heads of people who are working on roadsides, is mow in the early flowering stage and before seeds start developing. If you mow too late, you will spread them. And the timing is going to vary a lot from location to location with every species and with seasons. This year, everything's going to be early. And so any charts that we've made to encourage people to mow at particular times are all off for this year. And there's lots of extra helpful things that we've developed in our best management practices. And so we have listed things like mowing guidance and seed mixes that we recommend. So we encourage people not to plant known invasive species. Even ones like these two, birdsfoot trefoil and crown vetch, aren't on the NR40 list yet. And they were assessing them to go on in the second round that we're currently in. But we still are trying to keep people from, encouraging people not to use them. So this is an example of a mowing chart, and these charts are, we've got one in the back of this field guide that we've gotten out to all of the county highway departments. And so basically we identify when is it safe to mow in this green area, when is it not safe to mow because you're going to be spreading it around, and when is the best time where these little dots are. So like you can see with garlic mustard just blooms really early. And so if you've got a roadside with garlic mustard, then by late May, you're going to be spreading seeds around if you mow it. So, and this year that would be middle of May or early May. And then we also have these charts that are for other kinds of techniques, for other controls, like when is the best time to spray, or when is the best time to burn, or hand pull. So we do have this for a number of species. Then dealing with invasive species can be a lot of work. I mean, there's probably not a single 10-acre parcel in Wisconsin that doesn't have invasive species in it of some sort. And so you can't control everything. You need to kind of prioritize in some way. And you can do that by looking at what are the things that really you can do something about. You have an 80-acre woodlot and it's covered with buckthorn and garlic mustard. Maybe that's not the highest priority for you to work on. But then you have a small prairie remnant somewhere nearby and you're just starting to get invasives in that. Maybe that's a higher priority. So some of the priority things you should go with is prohibited species. Anything that's on that prohibited species list. And if you look on this chart and you see the ones that have a red map, those are the prohibited species. And so those are the ones that we really want you to report and let us know about. And we'll work with you to try to control those. Anything that's new in your area, new in your county, would be really important to get control of. Small populations in a new area, like even on your own property, would be a good, like a new satellite populations of garlic mustard, for example, are much easier to deal with than that big patch of it. And populations that are adjacent to important things like streams or parks. And then this is where we'd like you to report these things to. Some of this information is also on these handouts, so hopefully you already have that. But if you can send us photographs, that would be great. If you can send us actual plant specimens or even just a description of what you think it is, that would be wonderful. There's lots of ways that you can get help for controlling these things. And there's a lot of people in this room who are people that you can look to help with control. And there's The local DNR offices generally have somebody who can at least kind of give you a little bit of direction. Local land conservation departments generally have somebody who knows something about it, same with NRCS offices. We're trying to get some regional invasive plant groups going in this area, and so hopefully we can have a little bit more help there. And then, in addition, there's the people that you can pay to do this. There are contractors who do this for their living, and so there are people who can help you out. These are some of the local regional weed groups. There's a couple that are missing here. We've got a new one that's just developing in this area, and another one that's developing in the Black River area. And we have one that's trying to get developed over here, but it's having a hard time getting going. And then this one here, right, this Jefferson, Rock, and Green have been developed. There's kind of a big gap in this part of the state. So we would love to see a little bit more coordinated efforts in this part of the state. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that these groups work on. The two that are the most effective, or the most active right now, is this one in the southeast and the one in the far north. They both have paid coordinators. They have a board. They do a lot of different projects. For example, both of them have helped us by putting on workshops for public works people from municipalities and highway departments and gardeners about this new invasive species law. And they've done highway surveys. Both of those groups have done highway surveys. Some of the others have done highway surveys as well in different ways. Groups like the Door County group, they've been assigning people to kind of keep an eye on individual state natural areas up in Door County to keep some of the invasives out of those areas, to kind of have a steward for each of those sites. A lot of ways that you can get inventory work done, and by hiring contractors or interns, students, getting it done when there's other inventory work that's being done, like Marathon County had to do a sign inventory, and so they just hired somebody to do that actually understood plants to go out and do the signs. Very few areas, counties are going to be able to find a volunteer who wants to volunteer their whole summer to do the whole county, but it's a possibility. Or you can arrange a volunteer-based inventory. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And there's also things you can do to help train your local staff. Once you actually have an inventory, it doesn't do a lot of good if your local county highway department or others don't know how to use it, and they don't. They're not really interested. They haven't been engaged. We've trained all of the county highway superintendents and some of their patrol unit leaders, but they still need direction at the local level. And so in your own counties, you need to be working with them. And there's lots of help available there. And just some of the information that you could provide in a training session. Some of the resources that are out there. There's lots of stuff on the DNR website. The Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin has a website with good information. So unfortunately our website actually that's old now. I'm sorry, I didn't change it. DNR revamped its whole new website, and just basically you go in and type in the keyword that you want now, and that's the way to find things with anything in the DNR website. So all of these are good sources for information. And I just want to show briefly a couple of maps of what some other counties have done. This was Japanese hedge parsley, which is a new invader that's very abundant in Iowa County, unfortunately, and getting into Dane and Green. Not here yet as far as we know, but it probably is. We just probably don't know about it yet. This plant, they were starting to get concerned about it. One guy just went around with a GPS and just pressed his GPS every time he drove by a population. And so this is just from just his data. And then he drew big blobs around the major populations. So they know that over here, it's already a big problem. But when it starts popping up down in this area, that would be a really high priority area to control it, because you can keep it controlled. And maybe over here, it's still controllable. So you want to collect, you want to figure out what kind of data you want. You need to know who's going to be using this data. Is the highway department going to be using it? If so, then how do they want to use the data? and figure out what kind of protocol you're going to be wanting to collect. Are you going to identify the abundance, the size of the population, or just that the species is there? How much detail do you want in that? And of course, volunteers have to get trained, which is another thing we're going to talk about tonight. A project that has not worked very well and one that has worked well. So the Iowa County project. The Iowa County Highway Commissioner came to us and said, we want to know where the weeds are in our county so that we can mow accordingly. And we said, great, Iowa County's right next to Madison. It's got lots of botanist type people in it. We'll get you a volunteer-based survey done. And so they divided up the county into 9 patrol units, which is what the county highway departments call their people that do the mowing. And we assigned one botanist type person, volunteer, to each of those areas and said, go out and mark all of the invasive plants that you see on the county and state roadsides. And some of them did it and came back and said that was a huge amount of work. We had to go out like 4 times during the year, and here's my long list of things, and there was all this overlap between where one population started and another one stopped, and it was a lot of work. And most of the people ended up not doing it because it was too much work, because they were told, go out and identify everything and mark everything. And that probably was a big mistake on our part to do that. Another way to do it is the way that Southeast Wisconsin did it. Now, when they first planned theirs, I thought, you're really only going to survey 3 species? Don't you realize there's a lot more out there? And they're like, well, we're going to start with 3 species, get people understand how it works. And they ended up having like 138 volunteers do this. Most of them were people who had never done anything with invasive plants before. And they had pairs of people, so you had somebody who was a watcher and somebody who was a driver. And the watcher basically took a map, a paper map that the county GIS department printed out for them for each township. So each pair of volunteers had one township. They went out and they drove the state and the county highways and just marked where a population started, where it stopped, and how abundant it was, with a 1 being a really small population, 2 being medium, 3 being larger. And they just looked at these 3 species. And so they ended up having a lot of data come in, and almost every single township in 8 counties was actually done. And now those people are going to go back and gather more information this next year, because now they kind of got, they're interested in, especially if it's their own township they live in. And so this is an example of something that has worked, and so this is what we're using as our model. We're not going to use the Iowa County model because we don't want to follow failure. So also wanted to mention that there's a bonus in here for you. If you find a prohibited species in a county where it's never been reported before, and you report it to us, then you can get a reward for this. And this is through the Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin. They want to encourage people to report this. We just heard tonight about a new prohibited species that has been reported in a state forest, and nobody bothered reporting it to us. So they are not going to get their bounty for not reporting it. So with that, I think we can go into talking about the survey. The 4 species that we'll be looking at. One of the really nice things about these is all 4 of them you could survey in the fall or in the winter, because they all have are really distinctive this time of year. So what's this one?
Wild parsnip.
Japanese knotweed. Wild parsnip does not get this high.
But it really is interesting because it's hollow and it looks like bamboo. When it spreads like that too.
Yeah, and it's just starting to come up out of the ground right now.
Julie got these, by the way.
And we have, who is it that knows how to make a crisp out of this?
Crisp and a sauce out of that.
Did you really?
If you want to make some, see here for the
I
dirt.
tasted it.
It will not be in flower until really late in the season, so don't look for the flowers.
Where is it? What type of soil? Is it?
Generally wet, but not necessarily. And again, in the training session, you'll get more photographs and other things on this, but I'm just going to give you a taste of each of these.
Right.
Okay. What one is this? Phragmites, you all know this one because it is abundant here. Good. Okay. What one is this? Okay, teasel's a little tricky. There are two species of teasel. We're gonna lump them. They both act alike. They look kind of alike. One has purple flowers, one has white flowers, but otherwise they behave pretty much the same way, so they're gonna get lumped. And then parsnip, nobody brought in because parsnip hurts you to bring it in.
Yeah, plus it's kind of at least flatter in the winter time.
Usually by
so-
this time the snow's knocked it down.
Yeah.
But parsnip's pretty distinctive as well, and that one is going to be easiest to identify when it's flowering, which again will probably be mid to late June this year.
Yeah.
Now, for two of these species, the teasel and the parsnip, mowing at the right time is going to be effective to keep it from spreading by seed. For the other two, knotweed and Phragmites, they don't produce a lot of seed, which is kind of interesting. Some populations produce more than others, but generally they spread underground. But so, for those, the mowing time isn't as critical, but it's important that they understand where those populations are, so they're not spreading them by moving little cuttings. One of the things that happens with both of these is if you cut up the stems and they fall in water, they can root. The stems can root. So it makes it a little bit more challenging.